So, Chris, you were a Green Bay TV reporter during the time of Steven Avery's trial. Tell me, how did you get assigned to that case?
Yeah, so we had a lot of reporters at our station, and it was all hands on deck. This was by far the biggest story. In the 2.5 years that I was employed at WBAY TV, this was the biggest story. So every reporter at every station was covering the story. Usually Green Bay Packers is the biggest story in Green Bay, Wisconsin. But for 2.5 years, this was it. So me, along with all of my colleagues, were really engrossed in this story for the whole time it was happening.
And how long, I mean, what like time period, calendar-wise, how long was it from start to finish?
So I started in January of 2006, and that was a few months after Teresa Halbach went missing. And when I started there, it was just figured out that the charred human remains on the Avery property did, in fact, belong to Teresa Halbach. And I wasn't that familiar with the story at the time. I knew Steven Avery was this guy who had spent 18 years in prison for something he didn't do. But I really was not that into the story, so I really got a quick crash course on what was going on. So I started in January of 2006. The trial was in 2007. He was sentenced later that year, and then really there was appeal processes, and this was a huge part of my career the whole 2.5 years I was in Green Bay.
Sure.
Now, Chris, did you watch the Netflix series Making a Murderer yet?
I did. I watched it over the course of just a few days.
Yeah,
right
I
away
did the
after
same.
It came out.
I just did it recently, but it took me about I started on Friday and finished Sunday.
So some people
I think that's everyone. Everyone who's watching this is they can't stop watching. It's totally compelling.
It is the bingiest show I've ever watched, and maybe that's because it's not just a drama; it's actually real life.
Exactly. Yeah, that's definitely what it is. I think people love stories that are either based on a true story or that are a true story, and this certainly falls into the category.
Now, because this was real life for you, some people are saying that it's pretty one-sided watching that documentary. But you sat in the courtroom. Did you get that feeling after watching it?
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. It's very surreal to be re-experiencing the Steven Avery story all over again, this time at the national level. I thought that part of my life was over. But what's different this time is the majority of the people who watched his 6-week trial and who were there every single day had a totally different feeling than the people around the nation who are watching this 10-episode docuseries. And that's really kind of, I wrote a piece that was in the Star Tribune, and that's really the kind of the point I was trying to get across, is that this is only 10 hours of 6 weeks of nearly 1,000 pieces of evidence that were presented over 6 weeks. And we have to keep that in mind. If you really want the whole story, there's a lot of paperwork and a lot of digging you would need to do to figure out the whole story and all of the facts that were presented at the trial.
It's interesting to talk. One of the reasons I was excited to talk to you is because having watched the series, how it is done is definitely leaves a feeling of one-sided unfairness, mishandling, mistreatment. And I was looking forward to talk to you because you were actually there. And, I'm watching the series, and clearly it's through a person's or group of people's eyes and perspective. That's what we're being fed. And so I was just wondering, it's interesting to hear you say that, because I'm just wondering, well, how did that compare to what it was really like? So, yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, and one thing I should point out is the fact that these documentarians, extremely nice women from New York, they were very nice to us. I talked to them quite a lot during the trial. However, from day one, they had incredible intimate access to the Avery family. And Steven Avery's family hated the media. They would not let us talk to them. They avoided us at all costs. They always said no comments. However, these documentarians that came in from out east from day one were following them around with cameras, were getting these exclusive interviews. So it became pretty apparent what their angle was right off the bat, because they weren't going to convince the Avery family to go on camera with them if they weren't pretty upfront with them that they were going to tell this story through their family's perspective.
It's interesting that you say that. I can't tell you how many times I'm watching this wondering, how were they there when that call was made?
Exactly.
Somebody would call somebody from prison or whatever, and they're there recording it happening. Like, how did that but to your point, they must have just been there.
Yeah, and these women worked their tails off for 10 years. I cannot believe, like you said, I can't believe some of the audio footage and some of the video footage and all of the work they had to do to put this together. I give my ultimate kudos to them for putting this together and for working so hard to get some of that stuff.
Now, you said that there was kind of this feel that they had kind of an agenda. They had a way that they wanted to present this series. So what are some of the things maybe you feel like this series left out? Are there any pieces of evidence or facts that we didn't get to see in the series?
So before I go into that, this was 10 years ago. I'm not an attorney. I was not on the jury. So I can only speak to the things that I still remember today that stuck out. But a few things were the fact that when Avery was in prison the first time around, he told some of his fellow inmates about wanting to create a torture chamber. When he got out of prison, he wanted to rape, torture, and kill young women when he got out of prison. Another piece that sticks out to me is that when he called Auto Trader magazine to send out a photographer to photograph the van, he specifically asked for Teresa Halbach. That's not a normal practice when you call for a photographer. You just want any photographer to come out and photograph a van. On the day Teresa went missing, he made a series of calls using the *6-7 feature that blocks a caller's identity. He also called her office to specifically request her to come out to photograph the van, as I mentioned. And then finally, Teresa Halbach's DNA was found on a bullet fragment in Avery's garage from Avery's gun. Those are just a few. I know I mentioned in my piece that if you just Google what making a murderer left out, there's all sorts of articles out there, the top 10 things they left out. But those are the things that I remember most vividly. Wow.
So you got to sit in court with Steven Avery. What was he like? What kind of person is he?
Well, I think that the documentary does a really good job at portraying him. I remember, to be honest, the first thing I remember about him is, he'd walk past me on the perp walk every day, how short he is. I give him 5'4" at best. But that's just a personal little thing that I noticed. But he's a very, very simple man from Manitowoc County. And it's really hard to say because I think you can see in the documentary, he didn't really show a whole lot of emotion throughout the trial, and that's what we saw. As a reporter, you're trying to pick up on those nonverbal cues so you can better tell your story. He didn't really show a whole lot of nonverbal emotion during the course of the trial. So, and I never actually interviewed Steven Avery face-to-face. One of my colleagues did. She talked to him shortly after he was sent to prison in November of 2005. He did an interview with him at the prison, and he denied any involvement from the beginning, and he said that he was set up. And that's kind of the message he took from the very beginning till today.
I got just a little bit of a turn on this. We've been talking a lot about Steven Avery. Is it sort of because the Brendan Dassey part of this was also, I think people watched the series and had the same feeling about Brendan as they did about Steven. What's the feeling of folks like yourself that were in court on that angle?
So when I wrote my column that was in the Star Tribune on Monday, I intentionally didn't mention Brendan Dassey's name because he's a completely different story than Steven Avery, and I just didn't have enough time to get into that. This is a kid that is mentally slow. He's taken out of school to talk to law enforcement officers about his Uncle Steven. That's what he's told. Now, most reasonable people would say, why the heck would you give a false confession, especially when it implicates you? Well, this kid, he lacks social intelligence. He was told that the sooner he cooperated, the sooner he could go home. So he was thinking only in that moment. He goes, can we get this over with so I can just go home?
Right.
So the defense that he was coerced into his confession, it's not entirely inconceivable. And I have a different feeling about that case than I do about Steven Avery. So I didn't get into that when I wrote my column.
Yeah, and even just watching the show, that's a whole different level of... I mean, you could even take that out, and then Steven Avery thing kind of stands on its own anyhow.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, Chris, I've got one more question for you. You've gone to his property. You've been around his family. You've heard both sides. Is this guy guilty, in your opinion?
Well, as I stated earlier, I really don't think it's my place to overtly state my opinion. But what I can say is that the majority of the people who sat in the courtroom for Steven Avery's six-week trial felt significantly different from the people who are binge-watching this 10-part docuseries. It's just a totally different feeling, and it's very surreal to be seeing these petitions of people asking the president to pardon Steven Avery, and all you have to do is read the comments section on my Star Tribune column, and it's very clear that the opinion I'm sharing is unpopular, because these people it shows the power of television, really.
Yeah, I mean,
people are watching this piece of entertainment, and they're getting very strong feelings about it, and they feel like they need to do something about it to fix this.
Well, the documentary was really well done, and it was really persuasive. We joke all the time in here about the fact that, hey, it was on the internet. It's got to be true. A lot of people think I think that same thing goes here. It was a documentary. It's got to all be true.
Right.
That's just taken at its face value without thinking beyond that.
Absolutely. And the one thing I'd finally like to add, that the most important thing this documentary is doing is that it's starting a really important discussion about ethics in law enforcement. I vividly remember the press conference in March of 2006 where the media was told that there were no Manitowoc County officials participating in the investigation at the Avery property because of a perceived conflict of interest. It later came out in court that this wasn't true, and that's a huge problem. Manitowoc County, it's a small community. Everybody knows everybody. People can't escape their reputations. In this case, it seems like law enforcement couldn't set aside their preconceived notions about Steven Avery. So it's really important. The most important thing that's come from this documentary is we're realizing that law enforcement officials are human, and they have their own biases, and maybe investigations aren't always done perfectly and perfectly ethically at that. So I think that's really important to point out.
I guess that was my personal takeaway to a certain degree as well, is that, watching this documentary, I can't know whether Steven Avery did it or not, but it does scare me a little bit just to think that, I hopefully, if I'm ever falsely accused of something, whether he was or not, that the justice system works like the way we all think it does, or all hope it does, because that's scary to think that it might not.
Yeah, it's terrifying.
Absolutely. So let's focus our public discussion on that and keep it away from is he guilty or innocent based on this 10-part docuseries. Yeah. That's all I'm trying to say.
Nope, I think that's a good message.
I do too. I think it's great.
Thanks a ton for, just a short little conversation is awesome. After having watched it, it's nice to be able to talk to somebody who was actually there.
Well, thank you, Pete and Ashley. I'm a huge fan of the show, and I appreciate your time.
All right. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Chris. I really appreciate it.
Have a good day.